Hello, everybody, and welcome to the annual general meeting of Community Colleges Australia. And this is our guest speaker, Professor David Wilmoth, former Deputy Vice-Chancellor from RMIT and many other things beside. Now, I have a bit of an introduction with David because David is genuinely one of my oldest friends in Australia. I don't mean that he is one of the oldest people I know, but he is one of the people who I have known longer than anybody else. And that goes back decades. I first met David when both he and I started at the same time at the University of California at Berkeley. I was doing my master's degree, and David was the only starting PhD student at the time. At the time, he was also a bit of a refugee from the change of government. The Whitlam government had gone out, and David was a bit of a refugee on that. But David has had quite an extraordinary experience since then. And I think one of the ways for me to describe it is to give you just a couple of words, to quote some of his words from the introduction from his book, The Promise of the City. He writes that he has returned to the place of the formation of his values in the 1970s and now understands it for the first time. The two major threads of his life have always been intertwined: strategic urban planning and education leadership, with education a key part of urban development. Now I'm quoting David directly. The cities and towns in which most universities are embedded provided a rich learning environment. I saw the potential of consciously planned education hubs and technology precincts. This work aligns strongly with my values, as wider access and opportunity for learning is a key pathway to a more equitable society. Now, this is me talking again. The stories in his book document part of the greater societal changes of the last half century, many different ones which are very, very worthwhile. And following this AGM, I'm going to be offering a number of free copies of David's book, and I'll be having a certain quiz for those people to do that. David finishes with I'll just quote his final thing from his introduction, where he says, "Reinvigorating government and empowering civil society are necessary for a more humane capitalism and a more collective economy." So this is one of the ways I want to introduce David, who's a very deep thinker and is committed to both education and to cities in ways that I think is very unusual in this country. So David, I'm going to start with number one. My first question. The title of your book is The Promise of the City: Adventures in Learning Cities and Higher Education. Now, you make the point that informal and tacit learning makes cities, both places and institutions, into true learning environments. Can you elaborate on this?
I certainly can, Don, and thank you for that embarrassingly positive introduction. I'm preaching as a converted here, so many of you know this, but really let's go back a little. The very purpose of towns and cities is communication, and in particular, face-to-face communication. I'm a pre-digital native in a sense, but I've always noted how functioning cities are ones that facilitate face-to-face. And in business sense, that back in 1915 in New York City was called knowledge in a hurry. But cities that facilitate that work, and ones that do, the ones that don't. And I guess we all know that the threads of community that make up learning environments, and they're not just the formal institutions that often cluster in towns or cities, but those informal places. They might be, churches or religious institutions, libraries, cafes. After all, that's from where the Western office came from. All sorts of small nooks where we have courses, gyms, halls. We all know that, all those parts. And it seems to me that those understanding that learning environment can be nurtured or harmed by all those in the town or city, and what's good practice there, I think, is really important. And these things can happen spontaneously, or they can be planned. And so we see now a worldwide movement for learning cities, UNESCO network and so forth. So there's a whole lot of very specific thinking about how to do this stuff, but basically it all goes down mostly to that informal and tacit learning that occurs in the cracks often rather than inside the institutions.
Thank you, David. Now, look, the next one follows on from this. As you know, I'm a fan of the geography of learning, and and the beauty is that community colleges all fit into this and are the ACES providers. Now, in your book, you examine this. What works to enrich community learning in an area, and what doesn't work? What are the elements of success?
I'd say three things, given our time. One, we might be surprised by this, is permeability. That is institutions and spaces that allow movement, labor markets that allow job-to-job movement and retention and build-up of skills. I'm just thinking, we're all looking at Doha now, and Doha has this education city, which is a planned education hub. You go there and the security guards and all the discrete campuses, it's not permeable at all. And then you go to some of the cities in India and places like that, they're just buzzing with education providers in and out and this and that. It's extraordinary. And so that permeability, and of course, it's good university practice in particular, and for community colleges also, where easy come and go from workplaces into learning environments, research into practice, those sorts of things. When you don't have a permeable arrangement, it doesn't work. And it follows from that, obviously, that you have rich networks of linkages. If you have discrete colleges sitting in their own little campuses without much engagement, you don't get many of the economies of scale that comes from these learning clusters. And I don't just mean in cities, in towns and smaller settlements, you can also build clusters that aren't necessarily in the town, but in the region as a whole. So those linkages are really important. Again, it's around building skilled and labor pools, as well as life skills and lifelong learning. And the third bit that makes a difference, of course, is leadership. It doesn't have to be formal leadership, but people who kind of are able to bring together a vision, get some consensus on action, identify. Sometimes there are roadblocks. One or two things can open up a whole pattern of learning. It might be a missing institution or a new program or something. And so those elements, I think, are key. There are many others, but time is short.
David, I love those. Leadership, linkages, and permeability. I mean, what a great different framework that really fits, with our sector. And we have a new Commonwealth government. We have an election in Victoria coming up very soon, and one coming up, of course, in New South Wales. The three governments that we deal most with, and I think it might be a very opportune time to approach one or two or all three of those governments to be really trying to, talk about these in some of the big picture, rather than just, the mundane. So thank you for that and that framework. Now I'm going to move to the next question. You make the point that we talk a lot about the impact of education institutions on community and communities, but we don't talk enough about how local governments and councils can work with post-secondary education institutions and community providers. Can you explain more about that?
Oh, yes, indeed. And we have lots of these studies that groups of education providers use to say, hey, we're important because it's not just through the skill building and all that, but through the procurement and the activities and the hosting international students. But very often we don't look at best practice the other way about what towns and cities can do to nurture and support learning in their own environments. And it does seem to me that you see some good examples where they don't have to be explicit. They just have to, again, often it's in the hands of local decision makers or state government decision makers to do something that makes it work. It might not need much. I remember I used to chair the Knowledge Precinct in Melbourne, and it was set up in order to create an environment for R&D and learning in the parkland strip to the city. We folded up because really there wasn't anything that we needed to do because that was such a spontaneous cluster that was working. It worked on its own right, and so I do think that there should be more pressure on politics to create enabling environments, and especially for those who are blocked out of formal pathways and learning. And I'm thinking of things like university third age and that sort of thing, but and not just be obsessed with the main conventional streams of post-secondary learning in particular.
David, I like that very much. And in fact, earlier today, I spoke at a conference of Engagement Australia, which are the outreach and engagement people of Australian universities. And one of the topics that came up, and one of those that I briefly referenced, was education precincts. We have a few examples where our members have been in, but to my knowledge, none of them have worked especially well. Now that we've got some sort of movement and different changes in public policy, I'm going to be very keen to start moving again on this. I think we may very well have an opening for it. Now, David, I'm going to move to my final question for you for today, and that's really about regional and rural locations. Many of the Community Colleges Australia membership are located outside of metropolitan cities. In fact, it's about 2/3 of our members. And in fact, here in New South Wales, where most of us are, about 2/3 of our students are also outside of Metro Sydney. Now, how does your learning cities approach apply to non-metro and country towns in Australia?
Or just the same as discussed, Don. I'd like to just use a little example here. Quite a few years ago, Hamilton in Western Victoria was afraid of its economy going down the tube, but it's a fairly prosperous area. Well, wool was not looking great at the time. And there's sort of quite a bit of organic leadership around town. And people said, well, what is it? We don't know what our future is, but we know that it's going to be international. Okay, what do we do about it? And they said, well, let's get some international students out here, but they're the leaders of the future. We can make networks in their countries and maybe something will happen, who knows? And so they came to RMIT when I was there, and out of that came a program called RICE, RMIT International Community Exchange. Luckily, the activists who came from Hamilton looking around actually found some champions within RMIT. They weren't senior, but they were massively energetic. And out of this program came this extraordinary thing where international students from Melbourne would spend a couple of weeks in the Hamilton area. They'd be billeted, they would be in land care programs, the art gallery, they would be teaching in schools, in practica, etc. It was like across the whole community. And it was during a time when there was a degree of racism building up across the country, but starkly in some rural communities. And so this was a little bit of a shining light outside the community, and it attracted philanthropic money. And even Governor Gobbo from Victoria did an unusual thing by promoting this program quite politically as an anti. Anyway, it ended up working very well. In the long run, it sort of became a bit bureaucratized, but its heyday, it was just driven by community leadership and initiative, and people who could look past the present barriers. And I would just extend those principles we talked about before to these learning environments wherever they might be. I haven't addressed the digital that much, and that's often a key element in more distant regional settings. But I might just say one thing, Don, going back to what you said before. One of the key things about permeability is to remove some of the competitive nature of institutions that are clustering together and bring in a cooperative relationship. And in a way, the Melbourne cluster of universities have worked because there seems to be I wouldn't say a cultural cooperativeness in Melbourne that doesn't exist in Sydney, but I'll go ahead and say it. Whereas in Sydney, they're pretty well fiercely competitive. And so you don't get the benefits of scale. But both cities, and of course, right around the country, the clusters of community colleges and private providers just make for wonderful streets. And the more that we can make these environments attractive, with all the other ancillary facilities around them, the more exciting those towns and cities become, let alone the opportunities they bring. So Don, thanks for the chance to talk here on Gadigal country. I'm sitting here in the sunshine in Randwick, where the Gadigal people used to communicate between Port Jackson and Botany Bay. And there's a sort of a long communication route along the ridge, Frenchman's Road, it's now called. So I'm sort of pleased in my own way to try to learn about what the origins of all these places I'm in are. And I think it's all a key part of our placemaking as Community Colleges Australia. Thank you.
David, thank you very much. We've been talking with Professor David Wilmoth, now retired, but still very active with a wide range of community, not-for-profit and other activities, both in Australia as well as overseas.